and welcome to the school's noon talk. I'm Andrea Rother. I'm the head of the Environmental Health Division, which is hosting the noon talk today. And I'm glad to see that some of you have come, because I think this is a really important topic. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. C Godsmark. I don't know why I always slaughter your name. So Christy's been working with us in the division since May, and she's been moving into issues to do with climate change and working on pesticide topics with me as well. But she quite recently completed her PhD, and I had suggested that she should actually share what she had done, particularly before joining a public health department, but also because it's an important topic and it's an important bridge to see how scientific research is a part of public health and the kind of work we do in public health. So her background is in cardiovascular physiology and ergonomics, and she completed her BA and BSc honors at Rhodes and her MSc Med here at UCT. And her PhD on human thermoregulation in extreme environments, which she's going to talk about today, was at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. And then, as I mentioned, she's now a junior research fellow and a lecturer here with us in the division. And so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Christy. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the work that I conducted for my PhD. It was at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. And then I conducted some research at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And it was part funded by Portsmouth and the Ministry of Defence and Defence Science and Technology in the UK. I worked with Dr. Jim House and Professor Mike Tipton, who are really well known in the field of thermoregulation. I titled it "In the Heat of Battle, Thermoregulation Under Extreme Heat Conditions During a Chemical Attack." But really, it can be applicable to many occupations. And looking at things, especially in the context of climate change as well. So I've just listed, shown images of some occupations here where thermoregulation is important to consider, particularly in these types of settings where personal protective equipment, PPE, is required to be worn. Climate change projections of a warmer, drier future largely, and so with an increase in temperature, there's been links to increase in civil violent conflict, interpersonal violence as well. So it would be expected that more scenarios like this would be seen with police and military personnel in PPE. Infectious diseases are also predicted to increase in their range of expansion and proliferation. So these are the health workers during the Ebola crisis, at a very hot part of the world as well, that also suffered or reported feeling heat strain as well. Climate change projects that there's likely to be an increase in fire due to increased temperatures, drying, wind, etc. So more firefighters would be at risk. And then just a few more, like increase in pest and vector ecology with increasing temperatures. There's expected to be increased proliferation of pests, and so there would be more chance of pesticide applicators having to apply pesticides, and we need to be wearing protective equipment even though they are not very protected. And then there's other environments as well, specifically for the South African context, where looking at thermoregulation would be, or should be looked at within these contexts. So my PhD, like I said, was funded by the Ministry of Defence, and so they were obviously concerned about what soldiers feel during military exercises and in the heat. The state of warfare is one of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear attacks. So this is called CBRN attacks. Things like cyanides, mustard agents, sarin gas, anthrax bombs, this is where warfare is heading into. And to protect themselves against these hazardous agents, soldiers are required to wear equipment that looks like this. We call it fully encapsulating chemical, biological protective equipment. It's fully encapsulating because not a lot of air is allowed inside, so you're protecting yourself against chemical, biological agents. and very little or none of your skin should be exposed to the environment. So they're required to wear things like a full-face respirator made of rubber and plastic front with filter masks that will filter out any hazardous agents from going into the airway. They wear butyl rubber gloves. These are completely impermeable to any water. No water is allowed in or out of these gloves, and they wear a cotton liner underneath those gloves to stop the hands from wrinkling when they get really sweaty. The suit itself, we call it a semi-permeable suit. So it stops any agents coming in, but it does allow a small amount of sweat to evaporate. So it's not completely impermeable, it is semi-permeable. Some sweat is allowed to leave. And then they also wear overboots. So these are butyl rubber boots that they pull over their normal combat boots to protect their feet and legs from any contamination. This map comes from a defense standard document, and it was useful to us in figuring out what sort of temperatures we should be looking at and what people are exposed to. Anything in red is extremely hot and dry conditions, anything in orange is hot and dry, and anything in yellow is intermediate. So the area of interest for the UK military, based on current and perhaps projected warfare, would be in that area over there, which is considered as hot, dry, or extremely hot, dry areas. So we gathered the data and had a look at the average daytime air temperature is about 40.5 degrees Celsius, so it can go up to 46, 47, 50 degrees Celsius during the day. But on average, it's about 40.5 degrees and 20% relative humidity. So this is an extremely dry, desert-like environment that's very hot. Within the context of climate change, usually climate change projections are represented by graphs such as these, where you have representative concentration pathways, RCP. 2.6 represents a low emission scenario, and 8.5 represents a high emission scenario. And projected climate change, therefore, is by the year 2100 is to range anywhere from about 2 degrees Celsius up to 6-7 degrees Celsius. So thinking about those sort of temperatures, adding on to 45-50 degree already, and this is the way that warfare is moving, and in fact other occupations as well that have to wear protective equipment. I'll give you a brief background on thermoregulation because I don't want to bore you too much from a physiological standpoint, but basically you can lose and gain heat through different mechanisms within your body and the environment. Gaining heat through things like convection, so when a hot wind passes over your body, things like conduction, when you're touching something hotter, your body will gain that heat, radiation from the sun, etc. The mechanisms or pathways that you can lose heat from your body, things like respiration, when you breathe out, you lose a little bit of heat in a cooler environment. Convection, if any cooler air passes over you, then you're able to donate heat to that environment. Conduction, if you touch something cooler, you're able to donate heat. But the main mechanism that your body uses to eliminate heat from the body is through the evaporation of sweat. So when you exercise or move or do any activity or work in an environment, you're generating metabolic heat within inside your body, and your temperature inside is going to increase. Your body has to try and stabilize that temperature at a certain level, and it does this through these heat loss pathways, but primarily through evaporation. The physics of it is simple. When you take a liquid and you convert it into a gas, so sweat into water vapor, you need heat to do that transition, and in doing so it grabs the heat from the skin. Your skin then gets cool, and any underlying blood is cooled, which then gets taken back to your heart and distributed around your body. So that's the basic principle of how sweating cools you down. But when you're wearing clothing, or when you're working in a humid environment like a jungle, your sweat evaporating capacity is diminished. This table just shows the 3 stages of exercise-induced hypothermia, so when someone is getting dangerously hot. So your body will always try to compensate at a core temperature of about 37 degrees to 39.5 degrees Celsius. Your body will always try and keep your temperature inside at about 37 or 37.5 degrees. But it's able to regulate through these heat loss mechanisms up to 39 degrees quite efficiently through increasing heart rate, increasing cardiac output, skin blood flow, things like that. You enter into a crisis phase when your core temperature gets between 39.5 to 41.5, arguably, degrees Celsius. So within this zone, your body is entering a crisis of hypothermia. And things start to go a bit wrong. You get tachycardia, so your heart rate increases too fast. Skin blood flow either goes up or down. Cardiac output goes up or down. And you enter into a phase of failure, which is anywhere above 41.5 or even 41 degrees Celsius. Your body is entering failure, and here you can have neurological problems. You can have delusions. It can enter into a coma. Your heart rate is extremely high. You actually stop sweating, and this can be fatal. So in the context of wearing protective clothing, any sort of protective clothing, when you exercise, you generate metabolic heat production, and this increases your body temperature. There's two pathways that can happen. Either you enter into the safe pathway, where thermoregulation, your body's capacity to eliminate heat from the body or to control it at around 37.5 degrees Celsius. Either it's unimpeded, you enter into a compensable heat stress, where your body is stressed, it's feeling heat, but it's able to cope with that heat, and this is safe, you can continue exercising. But if you enter into a stage of impeded thermoregulation, such as when wearing chemical protective clothing or any type of protective clothing that has insulative and restricts evaporative cooling properties, then thermoregulation becomes unimpeded. So the partial pressure of water vapor at the level of the skin is then, it's less than what is at the level of the environment. So it doesn't favor the evaporation of sweat into the environment. You're not able to evaporate anything. So your thermoregulation is impeded, and you reach a state of uncompensable heat stress, which means your body temperature is going to keep going up and up and up, because your heat production is much greater than your heat dissipation. You're not able to get rid of all this heat. You then start suffering heat illness, heat exhaustion, and it can lead to heat stroke, which can be fatal. And that's just when wearing protective clothing, let alone if you're in an extremely hot environment to begin with. What I want to illustrate with this table is that when you're wearing protective clothing, and in this table specifically for chemical protective clothing that's semi-permeable, but when you're wearing this, you're at risk of heat stroke at an ambient temperature of about 25 degrees Celsius. If you're working heavily, within an hour you could suffer heat stroke. But the important thing about this is that when wearing protective clothing, even in an environment that's about minus 20 degrees Celsius, an extremely cold environment, if you are working heavily, heat strain is still possible. So you don't have to have a hot environment to suffer heat strain when you're wearing protective clothing, and this applies to other occupations as well. As physiologists, we're very interested as to how the body responds to a hot environment. And this is a sweat map, so it's generated at a low intensity, exercise intensity, and a high exercise intensity. And the purpose of this is to show you that your body doesn't sweat the same everywhere. Some areas will have a higher sweat rate than others. So for example, your forehead and your upper back, these areas have a really high sweat output. So as thermal physiologists, we're interested to tap into these areas and to try and promote evaporation and evaporative cooling from specific areas. Your body also doesn't feel or perceive the same things from all different areas. So this is a cross-section of a parietal lobe of your cerebral cortex, so cross-section of your brain, and this is the sensory part of your brain. The longer the line over here, the more feedback the area has to your brain. So this looks a bit complicated and can be represented in a different way, which is through using a somatosensory homunculus. So this is a nice graphical way of seeing something, the way that your brain sees your body in terms of somatosensory perception. So you can see that anything that touches the face and the hands are quite important to the brain, compared to like the calf or the forearm, for example. So I'll just detour a little bit away from like my purpose of my PhD and more just to show you some thermophysiological techniques that we have. because I think it's quite important that in any occupation that you study, that you're able to measure what the person is feeling, and perhaps we should be bringing a bit more of this experimentation into public health. So we can measure the environment, normally through a device that looks like this, which is a wet bulb globe thermometer, or WBGT. It measures the wet environment, how humid the environment is. The globe measures the radiant environment, so your radiant load from your sun. And then the dry measures just your temperature, your ambient environment. And when we do things in the lab, we can put people in these environmental chambers. So at the University of Portsmouth, they have quite a sophisticated environmental chamber system there. We have 3 different chambers that could go to temperatures from about minus 30 up to about 60 degrees Celsius. We can regulate, well, I guess it's they now, they could regulate humidity as well, going from close as we could to 0% humidity up to almost 100% humidity. So it feels like it's raining inside the chamber. And they can assess or monitor, regulate altitude as well. So essentially you could be at a conducting an experiment where someone feels like they're at the top of Everest or in a desert. And we also, Portsmouth is the only university that has an indoor swimming pool as well, like a swimming treadmill that can be regulated at all these temperatures. So when they were doing a lot of the Olympics, people come and train in the pools and experience the environment they'll be in. But going back to WBGT, this encompassing measure of temperature, that it's not enough to only measure ambient temperature. You want to measure humidity and radiant load and everything all together in one measure. And you can see that a lot of Africa is in a moderate to high risk zone for heat exposure based on WBGT. So this will determine, it'll allow you to stratify how people can work as well. So at a higher WBGT, they're not able to work as much as at a lower one, where temperature might not give you that same sort of in-depth measurement. Okay, then the physiology, there's many ways that we can measure how people respond to the heat, and I'm going to show you just a few, there are more. So these are using sweat capsules where you can put at different parts of the body, and that's how you can produce things like those sweat maps that I showed you earlier. Basically, you pull ambient air and over your skin that you're measuring, and picks up any sweat that's there, feeds it back into the machine, which will then measure how much you're sweating, very simplistically. This is a handheld refractometer that measures urine-specific gravity, so it allows us to give an indication of how hydrated someone is. Heart rate is a very good measure of cardiovascular strain, which is indicative of heat strain, because your heart is going to beat faster when you're in the heat in an attempt to dissipate heat. We can use things like infrared thermal imaging cameras. Not advised in a lot of scenarios, but they are useful in some, where it reflects light back, and so you're able to see within your frame what areas are hotter or cooler. This down here is a laser Doppler system. So it is a small laser that's passed through your skin and measures how much skin blood flow you have. It's quite a sensitive measure. People normally do it at rest. Then there's some strange ones like this. This is where they're trying to do convective cooling, so they're passing it over certain areas of the body. And then this poor Canadian was my subject for experimentation, and we put him in a poncho to try and get him hot, and there's a lot of things you can do. We can also measure how people feel, and the nice thing about this is that we can do it quantitatively. So this is from more of an ergonomics perspective. It's a body discomfort map, where people can indicate, my hand is sore or my calf is sore, on a scale of how much discomfort they're feeling. And then, sorry that you can't read it, but these are scales of thermal sensation, thermal comfort, and skin wettedness, which people can rate on a visual analog scale as to how they're feeling. And then a rating of perceived exertion, which is normally used for cardiovascular strain, but for people to let us know how hard they feel that they're working. Then body or temperature we try and measure as well. So skin temperature, you can measure this through skin thermistors, little electrodes that are attached to the skin, thermocouples, and an infrared camera, as I mentioned. Core temperature, there's an issue about whether it should be called core temperature anyways, because where is your core? Is it the middle of your body? Is it your heart? Is it your brain? But let's just call it core temperature. One of the methods is esophageal. You can't see it here, but there's some tape on this guy's nose because he's passed about a 25 centimeter probe through his nose down his esophagus, and it sits close to the level of his aorta, so it gives an indication of heart sort of temperature. Aerial thermistors, so this is another small probe that we put, you feed it really close to the eardrum and then insulate it a lot so that the ambient environment doesn't affect the probe's temperature, and that's an indication of brain temperature. And then this guy, I'll let you guess whether he's using a telemetric temperature pill, which is a little tablet that you can swallow, and it sits, you swallow it a few hours before the experiment, and it sits in your stomach, and you're able to monitor people remotely, so it's useful when people are working in mines, for example. Or he could be wearing a rectal thermistor, which is a temperature probe that is past 15 centimeters beyond the anal sphincter, and they self-insert it. So that is what a lot of my participants used as a measure of core temperature. So the rationale for my PhD was that 2014 at that time was recorded as globally the hottest year on record. And with climate change projections of a warmer future, with temperatures predicted to increase between 2.6 to 4.8 degrees Celsius globally, and that can be up to about 7 degrees Celsius in certain parts of South Africa. There will be vulnerable populations that are going to be subject to this increase in temperature, particularly the elderly, those with chronic diseases, taking medications, children, those with mental conditions, psychiatric disorders, living alone. There's a lot of people that are vulnerable to increases in heat. But also people that have to wear occupational or protective clothing as part of their occupation. Fire and rescue, chemical and energy, military, health workers, etc. But because it was with the Ministry of Defence, the UK were concerned about their military exertional heat illness. So at that time in 2015, there were about 4.4 cases recorded per month of heat illness within just the UK military. So they wanted us to investigate this, and under the anticipated state of future warfare, wearing this sort of chemical protective clothing within the context of a warming climate, how can we keep these people cool and safe? So the aims of my thesis, retrospectively I can see these were the aims of my thesis now, but it was to quantify physiological and perceptual thermoregulatory strain of wearing all this equipment, the suit, the respirator, the gloves, the boots, etc. The second aim was to quantify exposing the hands versus the face or the head on pseudomotor, vasomotor, and perceptual responses, so how people sweat, their skin blood flow, and how they feel. And then the final aim was to determine the role of manipulating posture during recovery, which has important implications for fluid regulation that I can go into. Everyone has a tolerance time when wearing protective equipment, not only military protective equipment, but any occupational PPE. That can be determined by the starting core temperature, how hot they are when they put the equipment on and start working, and the rate of rise of core temperature, how quickly they get hot. And these factors can be influenced by many other factors, such as hydration, circadian rhythm, the menstrual cycle, aerobic fitness. Lots of factors can affect tolerance time when wearing protective clothing. But the two that I focused on for my PhD was the state of encapsulation, how much clothing they're actually wearing, and the physical properties of the clothing, so from more of a textile materials point of view. There are strategies of reducing heat strain, and I decided to punt all the ones that came out of the University of Portsmouth. The first one is extremity immersion, so this is the hands and the forearm, placing these in cold water in a hot environment, which obviously is only applicable to certain scenarios and when on base, not obviously out on an operation. Phase change cooling vests, so these are different liquids that will melt at different temperatures. And usually it's worn around the torso to keep people cool. And it's great in short operations of about 30 minutes to an hour. But once the phase has changed and the vest has gone from a frozen solid to a liquid, you then are surrounded with a piece of plastic with water insulating you from the environment. So obviously not a good idea for longer operations. Air-cooled vests, which would not be applicable in a chemical biological environment because you don't want to use any of the air to cool your body because it's hazardous. But it's used a lot for other operations. And it's difficult because in a warm environment, you're going to be pulling 40°C air over your body. And because it's dry, it will help the sweat to evaporate and keep you cool, but it might also, if your skin is not that hot, it might also make you hotter. So there's been different strategies of intermittent cooling, turning the vest on and off, etc. Then liquid-cooled vests again, but particularly with water. Jim House is piloting this at the moment where this liquid that is frozen and then melts, people are then, or soldiers are then able to drink that water, so it aids in hydration as well. But again, you're still then left with a plastic sheet around your torso, so not for that long operations. And then modifications to perceptions of cooling. So changing people's perception of how they feel. So with substances like menthol, for example, which is an interesting idea and really cool technique to use in domains like sports science, for example. But when you're looking at an occupational setting, you might not want to modify that perception. You want to know how hot people are feeling. You don't want to try and trick them into not feeling so hot. I used none of these strategies for my PhD. We looked at improving the moisture vapor permeability of certain equipment. So allowing more air to flow through certain equipment by altering the material, the textile properties, try and aid sweat evaporation. So there were 5 major studies that I did. I won't bore you with details. So the first 3 I'm going to lump together, and basically we wanted to see which item should be the focus for redesign. The 4th study was looking at exposing the hands versus the face. And the 5th study was non-thermal influences on sweating. So what else regulates your sweating response other than your temperature? And we were concerned about the influence of posture and exercise on this. So the first 3 studies, which items should be the focus for ergonomic redesign in reducing thermoregulatory strain? So I showed you different items at the beginning, the respirator, the gloves, we looked at body armor as well, and the boots. And which of these items should the Ministry of Defence put money into making more permeable? We did a lot of experiments, and I'm not going to go into the results in detail because I think it will bore you. So we had different work and rest schedules, and within the work schedules, we had people exercising at different intensities. And we were able to produce data like this, which our aim was to try and fan out all these really small differences between conditions. So we needed a really long protocol of about 3 hours of people working in a heat chamber wearing fully encapsulating protective equipment in over 40-degree environment. But what I want to highlight with this graph is that when we removed the gloves, this is the purple line, there was a dramatic decrease in whole body thermoregulatory strain. This is an example of what heart rate came out like. So you can see there where they rest and exercise, rest and exercise. That's a rest period, rest, exercise, rest. And then here they're doing continuous work period. We didn't change the intensity of how fast they were working. So what this shows is an indication of cardiovascular drift, where your heart rate's starting to try and compensate to get rid of this heat that you're experiencing. And then we look at, we were able to measure whole body rate of sweat evaporation, production. And what I want to highlight here is that this is the fully encapsulated condition, so the current ensemble that they have to wear. And it's about 50% effective. So 50% of the sweat that you produce is being used for evaporative cooling, which means that half the sweat you produce is not being used for evaporative cooling and it's wasted and your body's just dehydrating itself. So we wanted to try and tap into that sort of fluid regulation as well. So just some major results. Covering the torso, this was imposed a large thermal burden that was physiological and perceptual. No surprises, I guess, because it's a large surface area and it has a high rate of sweat production. But the problem with recommending to the Ministry of Defence that this would be a good area to try and improve the permeability is that a lot of load carriage is done at the level of the torso for very good reason. And they carry a lot of their equipment on their chest and back, and also ballistic protection. they're not going to be able to make a Kevlar sheet any less, the same amount of protected by improving permeability to it. So we recommended they focus on the gloves or the respirator. But basically, if you improve the moisture vapor permeability, you allow more air through, you decrease thermoregulatory strain in a desert environment particularly. Up here, these two solid lines show the difference between a hot and dry environment and a hot and humid environment. And a person's tolerance time at a moderate metabolic rate is about double that in a hot, dry environment than it is in a hot, humid environment, because there's no facilitation of evaporation of sweat. That's how our guys told us how they felt. They would fill out these visual analog scales as they were exercising. One of the main findings was that covering the hands imposed a large thermal burden. And considering that the hands account for 4.6% of total body surface area, they had a large or measurable reduction on whole body thermoregulatory strain just by exposing 4.6%. The physiological and anatomical aspects of the hands are probably to account for this. It's a high density of sweat glands that helps. There's a high density of capillaries and large arteriovenous anastomoses, which enable basically your hands have a high capacity for blood flow. They're able to have a lot of blood flowing into them, and then they're able to divert that cooled blood back to the heart for distribution around the body. Also, considering exercise and your hands being in your extremities, they're subject to a greater range of motion, which forces evaporative cooling as well. Conceptually, the hands always came out top over the face. And when considering the somatosensory homunculus, your hands are important. But a lot of the literature focused on improving thermal comfort around the face because it's thermally sensitive and for anesthesial alleviation. So people just feel better when their face is uncovered. But what we found in our experiments was that thermal comfort, people actually feel more comfortable when their hands are uncovered rather than their face, especially in a hot environment. So which item should be the focus of ergonomic redesign in reducing thermoregulatory strain? And we recommended that it was the gloves. Thought study is looking at permitting evaporative cooling at small body surface areas. So we saw that even just exposing the hands or the face still had a measurable reduction on whole body thermoregulatory strain. So we wanted to know how thermosensitive are these areas. How much sweat is produced per centimeter squared when you expose these areas? Yeah, I'm losing a few people. But the fluid regulation comes into all of this. So when you're wearing protective equipment and only 50% of the sweat that you produce is actually being used, then it makes sense to not produce so much sweat when you're wearing encapsulated clothing. And so we were looking at this sort of balance. We looked at certain areas of the body. We looked at blood flow at certain areas of the body. There weren't that many changes to the blood flow and sweat rate at these different sites. I'm just skipping over it because I think it's maybe a bit too technical, but the question was, is there a difference in thermosensitivity of exposing the hands versus exposing the face in that specific environment? And the answer was no. We didn't see many differences between our participants. And where there were differences, it would be unwise of us to roll out huge recommendations based on such small differences. But we did see some interesting results. We saw that again, when you expose the hands over the face, your body cools down quicker and better. So this was actually we exposed the whole head. And perceptually, it tended to favor the hands, but again, the differences were small, so we didn't want to make too many conclusions there. But we saw some really strange sweating responses when we put people in this environment. So this was our protocol. People rested for half an hour, they exercised for an hour, and they rested for half an hour. And the black is mean body temperature, which is a combined weighting of skin temperature and core temperature. And in recovery, that was high. But every single area except for the chest decreased sweat rate. Even though skin temperature, the temperature at these sites, was high as well. So with the thermal drive present, the body is hot, it needs to get rid of heat. Why is the body stopping to sweat? What is stopping the sweat from occurring? So this is where we looked at, is there a non-thermal mechanism at play? Maybe it doesn't have always to do with temperature. Is there something else that is happening? So going from exercising to seated rest, there's two things that are changing. It's your exercise is changing and your posture is changing. So which one is it? And is it a regional response, a systemic response, or was it just our equipment, the way we were testing? This is the way that your body tells, or that your brain tells your body to sweat. Different drivers for sweating. And we were interested in, does exercise and does posture have an influence in it? We conducted about 6 pilot studies in the UK. We did some physiological tests, we did some mechanical tests on our sweat capsule and their response time. Maybe they were getting clogged, there were a lot of issues. Or we looked at circumstantial, was clothing having an effect? Was there the effect of pressure on the skin having an effect? So I went to Canada to conduct the final study, which was investigating this a little bit further. And so what we found was that the thermal drive primarily comes from, the sweating primarily comes from how hot your body is, but exercise, but particularly posture, does have an effect. So just some conclusions that from a public and occupational health perspective, working in the heat can be debilitating. This is worsened when you're wearing protective clothing. Restricting evaporations from some body areas might be worse than from others. And there seems to be a perceptual hierarchy, which we would rate the hands, if not equal to, then perhaps above the level of the face. Surface areas can have immeasurable reductions on whole body thermoregulatory strain. So when we saw that when we improved the moisture vapor permeability at the level of the hands, people physiologically they were better and people felt better as well. Thermal pseudomotor regulation. Core temperature is the primary driver for sweating, but posture and exercise can have an influence. So this was important again with fluid regulation in whether should we be recommending to the military that once guys are out in the field and they're hot and sweaty, should they be sitting down and resting? Should they be standing? What should they be doing to try and conserve fluid when they're working in this sort of protective clothing? Or should we be trying to encourage sweating when they're working in their normal combat clothing, which is more conducive to sweat evaporation, evaporative cooling? And then looking at vulnerable populations as well. So remembering it always in the context that, yes, your body's temperature will affect your sweating response, but it could be different for different occupations, and there are other drivers that are impacting this. Then looking at policy and regulations when prescribing personal protective equipment. So it's often prescribed to protect the worker from an environmental hazard, but there should be a consideration of protecting the worker from heat strain as well, regardless whether it's in a hot environment or whether it's not. Strategies for cooling, recommendations and regulations on work rest cycles or how to appropriately wear PPE is important. Last slide, I promise. This is images that I had from conducting a 3-year degree at the Extreme Environments Laboratory in Portsmouth. So when I got back to South Africa, everyone was like, wow, the UK is so cold. And I was like, no, it's not. I spent most of my time in 40-degree weather, exercising and doing crazy things to try to cooler by making myself extremely hot. Some experiments were a clear win and we designed them well and they were methodologically sound. And there's a lot of pilot experimentation that just fails and flops and you just have to abandon it. So this was, I was wearing a blood pressure monitor, trying to measure ambulatory blood pressure, which is very difficult, whilst having an aral thermistor in my ear as well. Here I was exercising on a bike in chamber sets about 50 degrees with my hands in about 50, 60 degree water, trying to get hot and at the same time be cool. I don't know, it definitely wasn't a good idea. I thought it was going to be a bit of this, sitting behind a desk, looking at guys, soldiers in a chamber exercising and doing what I want them to. But it was actually more like this, So this is what my guys spent doing, my volunteers who we paid to do this. And the metronome, that's what I hear still to this day. But they would step in there for about 3 hours at a time. I think the longest experiment was about 3.5 hours in about 40, 45 degrees, very dry, wearing all this equipment, and then me telling them, sit up straight because I don't want your posture to be infant, you're sweating, and they're like, I don't care. Thank you, that's it.
That was great. Thank you. There's some questions.
About hydration guidelines.
Yeah.
As we considered.
Yeah, so for the UK are very pedantic about things like that anyway, so there are quite strict fluid regulation guidelines over there. But within all our experiments, every 20 minutes, we would give the guys water, generally unless we would purposefully hydrate them, which didn't happen that often. But yeah, we would give them every 20 minutes water that we measured to about 15, 16 degrees Celsius, because that resulted in the greatest volitional intake and didn't have that much influence on their thermoregulation. But if you are, if your fluid regime is not very regulated, like you can get people to drink water throughout your protocol scientifically if you make it to about 40 degrees, then, you know, if you put it to the same body temperature that they have, then scientifically it's not going to make a difference how much they drink. But our guys did not tolerate 40-degree water very well. So we cooled it down for them and then would regulate it, and they were only allowed 200 mils at a time. But in terms of the UK, yeah, they have very strict guidelines of what they have, but it's also dependent on how much water they can carry, because the more weight you're carrying, the higher you have to work, and so your temperature is going to increase as well. So it's always that constant balance of weight versus increase in thermoregulatory strain. And in the UK, I know, in South Africa, I know some organizations do have guidelines for drinking, whether those are implemented and enforced and whether water is provided. I don't actually know, but it is extremely important in these sorts of environment to be drinking as much as possible all the time.
Also cold water. Well insulated out of water bottle.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, the cold water, a lot of the time, and sports science might disagree with this somewhat, but a lot of the time, cold water itself doesn't really contribute that much to cooling within. It's more just feels better and is tolerated better. But in terms of heat balance within your body, it's not actually that much. It's more just important to have a lot of fluid so that you can sweat a lot.
They always use your body.
Well, yeah.
I don't know where that came from, but that was the...
I mean, it's that whole sort of drinking tea thing, yeah. And I think... Exactly, so I think where that sort of thing comes from, or eat curry or whatever, is to just sort of prompt your body to sweat more. So anything hot, your body is going to want to sweat more and will try, and but that only works if you're in an environment that's conducive to sweating, or that is favorable to sweating. In a jungle, it's not when wearing this protective equipment, you just drink as much as you can because you're always losing half.
A cup of hot tea then would be better for your thermoregulation than drinking really cold water.
So that's arguable. I would say no, because there's a lot of perceptual things that go on with it as well. And yeah, I would recommend not drinking anything hot in hot weather. I think that the gain that you'll get in telling your body to sweat more is less than what you'll feel by drinking.
Look at what they drank. Or was it? We've been working with workers.
Yeah, so we only just gave people water, and the Ministry of Defence mainly gives people water as well, but there are sort of health tablets and things that are available that they can take depending on the duration.
Fusions was about gloves. Doing the gloves, that actually.
Yeah.
The gloves.
So the way we did it from an experimental point of view is that they didn't wear the glove, but we put the weight of the glove to their wrist. So they're still carrying the same amount of weight, but we're simulating the most ideal situation, but ideal, that the material we cover their hands with is 100% moisture vapor permeable. Anything less than that, we would expect any less degree of improvement to thermoregulatory strength. So during some experiments, we would remove the glove entirely. During other experiments, they would wear a new prototype material that's been developed by DSTL and the MOD, that they would then wear new prototype gloves.
The challenge. Indicators, they have one type, and that's, completely.
Yeah.
Or,
yeah, without the technologies for textile redesign, it might just be advisable to then get them to break more, have them have more breaks so that they're able to cool down and expose their hands, but at the same time being safe as to how they take their gloves on and off.
Yeah, I was just thinking about a fireman, when you face incredibly hot environments.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, firefighting is like a whole nother level of thermoregulation, and there are some chambers in the UK where they simulate fire temperatures and actually have flames and stuff hitting people, but materials. So yeah, it's quite a big issue. But the nice thing about firemen is that they're generally close. A truck or something is close by to them, so they're able to have like air-conditioned coolers within their suits. They're able to carry ice packs, go in for half an hour, run out, and then change their ice pack. They're able to. It's a bit more like intermittent, whereas being out on an operation, you're out and you're left then until you come back. So there's a lot of research done around firefighters, and there's a lot of great technologies that can.
You almost have to, almost redo the study for every sort of category because it's so different.
Yeah, and then you're always balancing the weight carried, which will increase your, if you're carrying more weight, you're going to be producing more heat. Then you're going to have to cool down more. So is the benefit worth it? Got to look at that as well. Yeah.
Chrissy, a methodology question, I'm not if I'm in a psychologically stressful situation, I might also start sweating.
Oh my goodness, this is actually what I wanted to do my PhD on.
That's negligible in experiments?
No. So it's a huge consideration. And there are ways of studying it. I mean, you can even do it experimentally in the lab. You can make people feel anxious in the lab by shocking them, or not shocking them. And no, it's completely it's ethical. It's
sure in school.
It's okay, well, but there are ethical ways of experimentation of that sort of stuff in the lab. And yes, you would for sure sweat more in those situations. And looking at some of the heart rates that some people got up to, a lot of the time I had to stop people more on their heart rate. We had safety limits obviously in place. So we would stop people when their core temperature got to 39.5 degrees Celsius, and which was on the border, and a lot of time I had to stop people when their core temperature was about 39 degrees Celsius, but their heart rate was almost 200. So then they're young students, that's fine. But so then we have to stop them at certain safety limits. And so even in terms of heart rate, psychological distress can raise your heart rate as well. And it's a huge area that should be looked into. You should definitely be researched. And some lucky person will do their PhD on it.
Or you can do another one.
Yeah, maybe. Right.
You mentioned posture. Exercise and there will be next. What do you mean by posture?
Okay.
Is it like sitting down? Or
Yeah,
lying
so
down?
exact manipulation of posture. So people sitting versus people lying on their front, lying on their back, lying on their side. So we looked at it in the context, these are the guys wearing ponchos in Canada. So we looked at it in the context of having to wear some sort of occupational protective clothing that hampers sweat. But a lot of this literature have done it on patients in hospital beds, patients that struggle to thermoregulate. Should they be on their side? Should they be on their back? So sweat dramatically increases when you lie down, for example. You might not want to recommend that because you're cutting off half your body, so unless you have like a permeable mattress or something. But for us, it was, in the context of this, was mainly just sitting versus standing. And we definitely saw that when exercise stopped, sweat went down, even if you're so hot. So the making recommendations on such limited pilot type data is not a good idea. So I wouldn't want to speculate on that, but it does influence it and it needs more research. Yeah.
I really appreciate what you've presented. It's very good because, of course, from my work on and the recommendation throughout the world when you're using, so, you've got these highly toxic chemicals. The only recommendation where most of the workers in low and middle income absolutely no consideration for temperature. And
or they don't wear their protective equipment because it's too hot.
They self-regulate.
Yeah,
because you must. I mean, theologically, what do you feel when you get to those?
Okay, yeah.
Like you're.
Yeah, so the personal experience, the hottest I've ever gone to was 39.8. And it was perhaps a little bit higher because I was using rectal temperature. And you're extremely grumpy. Like, you're very angry and you hate everything in the world. But it just feels like someone's got a blanket over you and you're in this hot environment and there's no hope. There's nothing you can do to cool yourself down. And some people, I had two guys who just freaked out. They couldn't handle the feeling of being trapped in this heat. So they weren't able to carry on with the studies, obviously, because they just couldn't handle it. And you almost have to sort of, and I mean, I was in a lab, so it was so easy, but you had to like get into a little zone and just count every second and just hope it goes by faster. But when you're out in the open, it's really a hopeless feeling of just this immense heat that.
Well, that's what people say with the respirators, is they should just take them off. They feel they're suffocating.
Yeah.
They're drowning, they're suffocating.
Yeah.
Now you've got 25 liters on your back and you're spraying, you're walking up a mountain. So
Yeah,
exactly. You're not going to continue to.
Yeah, a lot of people were stressed out about having something covering their face, and particularly in the heat. But what we found in such a hot environment was that when you remove that thing covering the face, they were just like, this is just as bad, because your skin temperature was probably sitting at about 40 degrees of your face or your cheek, whereas your environment is about 40.5, 41 degrees. So you're still gaining heat. But with your hands, you're swinging all the time, and they're sweating a lot more, and there's a lot more evaporative cooling. But the face, it might feel better in some environments, and under some conditions, it's really good. A lot of sports people are trying to cool the face and make themselves feel better. Worse. Mm-hmm.
Just a stressful things.
Yeah.
So not even your environment, just a lot of people feel So you've got your 39 degrees, then you've already got stress of your environment, then you've got stress of that thing on your face.
Yeah.
A lot of stress.
Absolutely.
Did you consider any of that, the equipment itself, without the...
Yeah, so what we did is, like obviously in the military, the guys are soldiers, they take it or leave it. If they leave it, they don't go into the military. In the lab, we would always I'd have like familiarization sessions where I'd show them a rectal surface. They weren't going to do that and they're out. But then they thought about 80 pounds and they were like, maybe. But they would try the respirator on as well. People just didn't like it. What we did do is smash open the respirators and take out the filters, so that, because we didn't need to filter anything, so that there was free air flowing through the vents. But it was, yeah, people panicked about it, and some people just can't handle it, and that will for sure add to the stress that they're feeling. As well as that, our guys weren't carrying it, but they're also normally carrying about 25-30 kilograms of body armor and then equipment as well.
How does physical training change all of that?
Quite a lot.
You said
Yeah.
you did experiments with volunteers. And
Yeah.
Would it have been different if you had military people?
Yeah, for sure. Well, in terms of, yeah, there's a lot to that actually, because it could make a difference. So we looked at the VO2 of all our guys who participated anyway and saw that they were at an average level of fitness. So already they were not too far away from military guys. But what happens is when you're exposed to more environments, you can adapt to your thermal environment, and then you're able to produce more sweat. Anyways, if you're hydrated and if you're fit, you've got a higher plasma volume, a lot more fluid can circulate around your body, and you're more efficient. It would only make the results better. You know, like if they're fitter and they're in the military, then they should have seen a bigger difference than what we saw in these guys. So it was a bias in the wrong way, which it does make a difference, yeah, for sure.
We often mention of young guys who buy training for the military. And
Yeah, so
they're not wearing.
yeah.
You can get...
So
that wouldn't take illness, per se, or weight.
Yeah.
Maybe that was stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of those times, there's two things there. What's interesting is that a lot of the time it's a cardiac event that occurs, which could either be the result of your or some underlying. But what was the question that you had in there?
I was just making the point that.
Oh yes,
military
I remembered my
exercise,
thing. Okay, is that actually a lot of the time the illness and the injuries that we see in the military are not actually coming from chemical protective scenarios. They are quite good at having these regulations and rules and hydration strategies and everything. Plus, there's not that many chemical attacks compared to other operations that they're on. So a lot of the time, the illness is coming from that are just part of normal infantry and that are exercising already. Yeah, who are having issues, and that can stem from hydration to overexertion in these environments.
Where to?
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And then you guys are having. No, it is, and it is a big field. And Carol House in the UK at Institute of Naval Medicine is looking at. I don't know if they're looking at what are predisposing people to being more vulnerable
very much for that stimulating discussion. It shows you how important anyone needs CBD.
Why, thanks.
Does that mean that if I want to sweat a lot, when I go to the gym, I have to wear stuff on my face and gloves as well? Will that?
You have to just be hydrated and work hard, and you actually have to move your body at the gym.
No, I just wanted to go there instead.
Go to a sauna.
Put gloves on and a face mask.
Okay, good for you.
That was very good. Very proud of you.
Thanks, man.
You did well.
Yeah, it's hard to put a technical thing into something that's general.
Yeah, no, but it's good. And also very. And you have quite a few doctors in here as well. Yeah, you've got 3 registrars.
Nice.
Now, you have the CBD model.
Thanks so much for coming. Sorry? Yes. So you guys, you're in a lab, you have a lab set up, right?
I have, but our lab is currently pretty archaic, especially in comparison to what you would have been exposed to.
Okay. No, because I started my PhD at sports science with Laurie. Yeah, but I couldn't get funding, so I went to the UK.
How did you get that you got your PhD with them?
Over the UK? No, I'm actually British. Yeah. I actually only have permanent residency here, and that's why I struggled to find something here.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So I was going to do some rock climbing stuff with Laurie and heart rate variability.
Yes.
But I couldn't do it, so then moved over. But I was only there for like 3 months starting. I did all the courses and everything. And yeah. But no, it was good. So I'm familiar with the building, but not your lab in particular.
So
is it
on
with
the second floor, opposite where the big lab is.
Okay.
There we have a chamber there, and they have the metabolic lab. They also transformed it into the sleep lab.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
No,
it
seems.
but it needs a bit of a revamp. Like the humidifiers, giving us quite a bit of trouble and stuff.
Yeah.
But there's no point to.
No, that's a
I'm
huge
like the only
equipment thing.
person doing the research still.
Really?
But nobody else is doing thermoregulation stuff. Which is so sad.
And South Africa should, because Ross Tucker was doing a lot of it, wasn't he?
Yeah, but you know I was with Free State.
No?
Yeah.
Okay, that's why. I don't know. Thanks, Jeff.
He's not involved in any of our research, which is very sad.
That is really sad because he was involved in everything.
He's such an excellent translator of stuff.
So